looks like we are now live. I want to welcome everybody here tonight, our Wednesday night Bible study, in our beautiful sanctuary here at South Haven First United Methodist. Thanks for you at home who are joining us. Some of you are live with us, others will be watching it later on. Either way, we're glad you're a part of the service and joining us here who are in person. All right, well, let's pick up with Genesis chapter 15. We're going to finish chapter 15 and get into the first part of 16 tonight. And so let's go to Genesis chapter 15. We'll pick up with verse 7 again. And as we are opening up our Bibles, let's also open ourselves up now with the word of prayer. Gracious, loving Heavenly Father, once again, we thank you for this time of study, of being one with each other, with you through the power of your Spirit, the same Spirit that brought your word into completion for us. Your word that you use constantly in our lives to strengthen us and bless us, but most importantly, to reveal yourself to us. And once again, dear God, as we continue our study in this book of Genesis, as we're now looking at this great story of who we know as Father Abraham, continue to bless us, and you lead us and you guide us now. As once again, we take ourselves and we place ourselves into your loving, life-giving hands. We ask all this in your holy, mighty, and very precious name. Amen. All right, so join me again at verse 7 here. Then he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But he said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? He said to him, bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. He brought him all these and cut them in two, laying each half over against the other. But he did not cut the birds in two. And when birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and a deep and terrifying darkness descended upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, know this for certain, that your offspring shall be aliens in a land that is not theirs, and shall be slaves there. And they shall be oppressed for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve. And afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for yourself, you shall go to your ancestors in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the 4th generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, and the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, and the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. Okay. So as you know, last week we were together and we were able to look at those first 16 verses. And we talked about the fact, like I've always said, one of the great things about the Bible is how God uses His Word to reveal Himself to us. And for me, chapter 15 is a great way that God does this. And if you remember, as we close looking at verses 12 to 16, and we talked about the fact how God is letting Abram know what his descendants, something that his descendants are going to have to go through. They're going to be aliens in a land, but not just aliens, they're going to be slaves. And we talked about this as most likely a reference to their time in Egypt. But what God is revealing to Abram is this about himself. Once again, where he tells us in verse 14, I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, or that does this to them. God's going to bring them out. He's going to deliver them. God is showing Abram His power. It's about the power of God. But also in that verse, afterward they shall come out with great possessions. Some versions have great wealth. This is about the providence of God. That God is going to provide all that they need. And in return, in showing him all this, there in verses 15 and 16, we closed up by talking about the fact that God is now asking Abram to also take a great step of faith, or another great step of faith. Because all these things He's promising to Abram about this nation that will come from his offspring. If you remember, Abram will not see it. Abram is never going to see all this firsthand. It will be one of these things that occurs long time, 400 years after his death. So now let's pick up with verse 17 here. So as we see, now the sun has gone completely down, okay? There's nighttime. And what we can see here is God is now passing through the animals in the form of a what? Of what two things? You can see what it is? In verse 17. Okay, well, what's the first one?
Fire pot.
Okay, fire pot. Yours says fire pot. Mine has, the New Revised, says smoking pot. Also, I have a flaming torch. How many's got blazing torch? Or anything different besides flaming or blazing? Burning lamp. Okay. Burning lamp. Sorry, I heard the lamp part, all right? Either way, the thing is this: smoking pot, flaming, blazing torch, burning lamp. Right off the bat, I have to tell you once again, we have no idea what this means. We do not know to this day why God chooses to use the form of any of these things. There is no clue in the Bible given as to where this comes from. But God taking the symbolic form of a smoking pot or a flaming torch is not what should stand out to us. We don't know why, and we don't need to worry about why. What's important is in verse 18. Now, what we do know is this, that God is now making a what with Abram? A covenant. He's making a covenant. And it is what God does in making the covenant that now reveals to us one of the greatest things, one of the greatest truths about who our God is. And what God is doing here at this point can actually be traced to something else, to another book of the Old Testament. So what I need you to do is keep it in here in Genesis and take your Bible and go to Jeremiah. Go to the book of Jeremiah. You got Isaiah, and then Jeremiah, and then Ezekiel. I think that's right. Jeremiah and then Ezekiel. So you got all those in between there. No, Lamentations. You got Lamentations, then Ezekiel. So anyway, go to the book of Jeremiah, chapter 34. And we're going to discover something very significant concerning our God. So I'll give you a moment to go there. Once again, Jeremiah chapter 34. Jeremiah is one of those books we need to look at more often. We just don't. So sometimes it's kind of hard to find where it is. All right, are you there at Jeremiah chapter 34? Looking at verses 18 through 20. Is everybody there yet?
Chapter what?
Jeremiah chapter 34. This is where I want you to go. Alright? Jeremiah 34 verses 18 through 20. And Jeremiah 34:18 starts. And those who transgressed my covenant and did not keep the terms of the covenant that they made before me, I will make like the calf when they cut in two and pass between its parts. The officials of Judah, the officials of Jerusalem, the eunuchs, the priests, and all the people of the land who pass between the parts of the calf shall be handed over to their enemies and to those who seek their lives. Their corpses shall become food for the birds of the air and the wild animals of the earth. Now stay where you are in Jeremiah for a moment. So now the thing is, in Jeremiah that I just read to you, what we learn is this, is what is the result when someone breaks this covenant that is being done in this way, going between two halves of animals? What happens to the one who breaks this covenant?
They're going to die.
They're going to die. They will be handed over to their enemies and what? Killed. Their lives will be taken. And notice, their corpses shall become food for the birds of the air and the wild animals of the earth. Remember earlier, back in verse 11, how he has to chase the birds of the air? away from them? All right, so flip back. Go back now to Genesis chapter 17, chapter 15, verses 17 and 18. You see, in Jeremiah we learn this. It is within the making of this covenant that God is now making what specific promise to Abraham? That if if he doesn't, if God doesn't fulfill the promise that he's made, then God is going to do what? He will hand himself over to his enemy and let his what be taken away? His life. Or to put it another way, God is getting personally involved in this covenant by making the promise that if he doesn't uphold this covenant, then his life will be taken away from him. That's what God is doing with this. It reveals who God is. Because remember now, we're forming the what? Or God is forming what? The Old Testament covenant. That he is making with Abram, or through Abram, to the nation of Israel. And God is saying, if I don't hold this up, then let my life be taken away from me. Now, the thing is this, does this sound familiar in any way to you in another way? What covenant do we live under now? We don't live under the Old Testament covenant, we live under the what? The New Testament covenant. And who set that covenant? Jesus. And how did he set it?
Dying on the cross.
He willingly died to set this covenant, to make sure that it is upheld. God is willing to put his life on the line for us. He was willing to do it for Abram and for the nation of Israel. He actually does it for you and me by allowing Jesus to come, and Jesus dies for us. So to uphold the promise of God for each and every one of us. So it reveals, once again, just how great our God truly is. But there's one other thing about this covenant that I want to bring up. One of the things that I can remember being taught early on about this, a fact concerning it that should stand out, is that as God gets involved, what I was taught is that God is the only one who agrees to meet all the requirements given in this, covenant. God is the one who holds all responsibilities. He holds all accountability for keeping this covenant and not breaking it. But the question is that necessarily true? Think about it for a moment. Yes, God is the one that is stepping up and saying, I'm putting my life on the line, Abram, to make sure that this covenant is held up. But doesn't Abram have some responsibilities that he's required to follow? What responsibilities does Abram have? And I'm not talking about he's the one that got the animals, cut them in half, separated them out, kept the birds of prey away. What else was there? What is really required of Abram to keep this covenant? Abram must remain what? Faithful. He must remain faithful, and he must do what? Believe and trust in God. So there is a requirement that Abram has to make. And if you think about it, these are also the same requirements that who has to make in the New Testament covenant? Who has to have faith and believe and trust? Us. We do. We now are the ones that have to do the same thing that Abram does. So here we have God revealing himself, talking about, what he's going to do and, what he's willing to pay to get it done. Just a reminder of what he is willing to do for us when Jesus goes to the cross to form the covenant for us today. All right, so we just seen once again a beautiful reminder of who our God is. Now let's go to chapter 16. Because here we're going to now be reminded of our humanness. Okay? We're going to be reminded of who we are as humans. So join me in Genesis 16, and let's look at the first 6 verses. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bore him no children. She had an Egyptian slave girl whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, you see that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my slave girl, It may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her slave girl, and gave her to her husband Abram as a wife. He went into Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, may the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my slave girl to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. But Abram said to Sarai, your slave girl is in your power. Do to her as you please. Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she ran away from her. All right, now, so let's pick up here. As we now know, as we read throughout this, how many years have passed since God first gave Abram the promise that he was going to give him a son, all the way back in Genesis chapter 12, verse 7. How many years? It was read into this. 10 years have now passed, okay, since all this. Now look at verse 1. But immediately in verse 1, we read that the promise is not what? The promise is still not what? Happened. Hasn't come about. Now, it's at this point, because the promise has not come true, there are some people that believe that at this point, Sarai has now become desperate to have a child in some way. But me personally, I think she's just angry. I think she's now angry that she doesn't have a child. And what we discover, why we can say this, is found there within verses 2 and 3. In verses 2 and 3, within these verses, what is it that Sarai decides that she must now do? First off, look in verse 3. Sarai makes the decision to give her servant Hagar to Abram as what? As his wife. To give him as his wife, or as to be a wife, okay? And in verse 2, why does Sarai give Hagar to Abram to be his wife? So that she will what?
Bear a child.
Huh?
Bear a child.
For who?
For her.
Yeah, for her, not for Abram. But notice that I shall obtain children by her. Alright? So the thing is, Sarai is what? She's planning this for herself. She still wants children. Now, even though what Sarai is doing here, by offering Hagar to Abram as a surrogate wife, is well-known common practice at the time, and this is something we're going to look at in detail coming up in a few more minutes. What was Sarai's real reason, her purpose for doing this? Now look at the first part of verse 2. In the first part of verse 2 it reads in the New Revised, and Sarai said to Abram, you see that the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. So what is Sarai doing at this point?
Trying to get even with God.
Well, trying to get even with God. I would have said it a little differently. She's blaming God is the way I see it. She's trying to get even with him by putting the blame on him. Let's say it that way, why don't we? She's trying to get even with God, trying to make herself not look so bad in the eyes of Abram by turning this around and blaming God. She's in fact blaming God for the fact she has no children. The question is this, is she wrong?
Well,
no, she's not. God is the one who is preventing her from having children up to this point. Alright? God is stopping her from having children because why? Why can she not have a child yet? It's not time. Thank you. It is not time. Once again, maybe it's not anger, she's just impatient. Because it is not time. This part here is not a part of God's plan. Which then leads us to the real reason why Sarai does what she does. which is actually what? She's doing more than just blaming God. She's now going to take what? Taking the matter into her own hands. Alright? She's going to resolve the problem herself. You see, since God has prevented her from having a child, this must mean that she needs to get involved and help who out? Help God out. God needs some help on this. Okay? Sarah knows that God has promised to give Abram children. The thing is, to this point, the promise of children to Abram was not necessarily to come by or through her. Things, even though up to this point, Sarah has been a very important part of the story, and we all know that in the end, she's the one God is going to use. She doesn't know it. Because look at the promises given by God to Abram in these verses. Look at Genesis chapter 12, verse 2 with me. Just flip back a few pages. In Genesis chapter 12, verse 2, I will make of you, speaking to Abram, I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. Then look at chapter 12, verse 7. In Genesis 12, 7. If I can find it here. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. Now flip over to chapter 15, verse 4. Look at verse 4 of chapter 15. But the word of the Lord came to him, this man shall not be your heir. No one but your very own issue shall be your heir. So who's missing in the promise so far?
A son.
No, not a son. Who's missing so far in the promise? Sarah. Not one time in the promises is Sarah mentioned. All God says to Abraham is, I'm going to give you a son. I'm going to give you a child. And so in having Hagar, giving Hagar to Abram, Sarah has convinced herself she needs to get involved. Maybe she has come to believe that using Hagar is the way that God is actually going to bring His promise into being, to give Abel. Maybe this is what is supposed to happen. 10 years is a long time. And I was going to say, you can't really blame her, okay? She was old and she's desperate. Remember, this is her identity. Not being Abram's wife, it is being a mother. That's what gave her the place. It didn't matter if Abram's the richest man in the country right now. Nobody can beat Abram as far as wealth at this point. It doesn't matter, she's wealthy. She wants a child. So you can't blame her. But the fact is, this ends up, though, leading her to make a mistake. What was it that Sarah actually ended up doing? See, she sought to use her human will and her human planning to bring about what? God's what? God's plan. She's going to use human will and human planning to bring about God's plan and will for them. She's ignoring the fact that when it comes to God's plans, God always wants His plans to be done in which way or in what way? His way. In His time. Thank you. I need to add that. His way in His time. And so to accomplish God's plan, Sarah makes what could be considered back in this time a personal sacrifice. She's going to allow her husband to sleep with another woman, to take Hagar as his wife, become physically involved with her so that the promise of children can be fulfilled for her. See, it's still more about her, isn't it? Because she wants her to have children for her. Not really for Abram. So the promise of children can be fulfilled. But now, to make this personal sacrifice, Sarah shares her husband in what was then, it was an ancient Near Eastern common practice. And what Sarah does is a common practice of their culture, used when a wife is unable to bear her husband a child. Okay? The thing is, within this custom, who do you think is the one who has to make all the arrangements? Who would have to be the one to make the arrangements? The wife does. In the custom, this has nothing to do with the husband. The wife is the one who's required to make all the arrangements. And as we know, this practice continued on, this ancient Near Eastern practice, for many years. If you go on to Genesis chapter 30, who has two wives that end up allowing their maidservants to also become his wife and bear him more children? What guy, what leader of the Israelite people? Who has the two sisters, married two sisters? Not Joshua, Jacob. Jacob, his wives Rachel and Leah, that's their idea. They give maidservants Bilhah and Zilpah to him as wives. And the thing is, Rachel's one that starts it. Leah is having all kinds of children. Rachel has none. She gets jealous, so she gives Bilhah to Jacob. When Leah sees this, well, I can top that. I'll get you even more children. And she gives him Zilpah. The thing is this. You gotta understand. This practice, it was not created, planned, or even desired by who? By God. This was never anything God created. So the question becomes, it's a human thing. So the question becomes, why did God allow Sarah to follow through with this? Okay? Since this is something he didn't create, he didn't ever give them permission to do this, why does he allow her to do this? You see, it's believed that even though in time, God's going to do away with this. When they finally get set up, they come out of Egypt and they set up, and the laws are given, God's going to put an end to it, to this practice eventually. But until he does away with this practice, it is believed that God allows it to happen to reveal what can actually happen when people make the decision to follow their own plans and not God's plans. Because in the events of Jacob and his wives, the same major problem also arises within Sarah's plan. Because what ends up happening? Sarah becomes what of Hagar? Jealous. There's jealousy. She becomes angry. And then we have separation within the family. There's jealousy, anger, and separation, okay? That's going to be the end result. So God is allowing this to happen to show us what happens when we choose to do things our way instead of God's way. But look at verse 4. This is where it starts getting good. In verse 4, though, who was it that actually causes all the problems in this? Who causes the problem?
Sarah?
No, sir. Hagar does. The truth is, Hagar is the one who causes all the problems. She's the one that does what?
Conceive.
But she didn't conceive. Well, it's not just that she didn't conceive. That wasn't the problem. That's what Sarah wanted. But what did she end up doing to Sarah? She looked how? Looked with contempt upon Sarai, her mistress. The thing is, Hagar, even though was now a surrogate wife for Abel, she still belonged to who? Sarah. She's still her maidservant. And according to both in the custom and the law, she still belongs to her. And for Hagar to look upon Sarah with this contempt was still considered a terrible thing for a maidservant to do to her owner. But according to the custom, Sarah couldn't do anything to Hagar unless who gave her permission? No, not God on this one. Abram. She still had to have her husband's permission to do something to her. And we're going to look at that too later on. But even though at that time what Sarah did was considered to be the right thing to do. As a result, what lesson does Sarah learn from all this? Well, she learns what? That you should always be careful what you want.
Wish for.
What you wish for. Be careful what you wish for, because you might just what? You might just get it. And sometimes what you end up getting is not what you really wanted or thought that you wanted. This is what happened to Sarah. This was her plan, and she got what she wanted. The sad part is that what she wanted was outside of what?
Outside of
God's plan for all of these. Be careful what you wish for. You might just get it. Like those say, be careful what you pray for. You just might get it. You know? So the thing is, this is what's is going on with Sarah. Now it's here, though. We've got to stop and ask ourselves this question. Who are the two people that we've not heard anything from up to this point? Who are the two people we've not heard anything from? First off, have we heard anything from God? God has not spoken during all this. He's not spoken either to Sarah or to Abram and told either one of them what?
Quit.
Well, either to quit or what? Or proceed. This is what he wanted. Once again, remember what happened back when Abram goes into Egypt? We talked about this. He went to Egypt in spite of the fact what? God never told him to go there. He got there and he got what? In trouble. Because he lied. He lied to Pharaoh about who Sarai is. Well, once again, God has spoken. He hadn't told him to stop, but more importantly, he hadn't told him to keep going. He's not, and he specifically hasn't spoken at any point to encourage Sarai on this. Who's the other person we haven't heard anything from? Abram. Up to, when you get to this point, I'm talking about there up to verses 4. Up to this point, Abram hasn't said anything at all. What's the only thing so far up to this point in the story? Abram has done what at this point? In the last part of verse 2, he's done what? The last part of verse 2, what's the only thing we've seen Abram do? He listened to the voice of Sarai. Listened to the voice of his wife. Now, what other incident in Genesis involving a husband and wife should this remind you of? Adam and Eve. Because remember, that's what happened. Adam listened to the voice of Eve. It should remind us of that. Because just like Adam, Abram does not what? First off, instead of listening to the voice of his wife, that means he didn't listen to who? God. He didn't listen to God. He listened instead to what his wife tells him to do. But most importantly, he didn't try and do what? Change her or put a stop to it. He doesn't step up to be who? The spiritual leader. That the Bible teaches us that the man is supposed to be in a relationship. It's supposed to be that, remember we always talk about it, if Adam had just said, no, Eve, stop. We're not going to do this. What would have happened then? But remember, all Adam did was what? He just listened to Eve. When she said, here, get some of this, he just ate it. Abram just sits there and lets Sarah do all this. And as a result, we find out what can then happen when we make the choice to not listen to God, but the voice of somebody else in our lives. But then listen to this. What are the two ways, what are the two ways that Sarah then responds to how Hagar is now treating her? So look at the first part of verse 5. Then Sarah said to Abram, what? May the what?
May the wrong done to me be on you.
All right. So what is Sarah doing here? She's putting all the blame now on who? On Abram. She's doing it like Adam and Eve. She's passing the buck. Remember, Adam says, the woman you gave me. Eve says, the serpent made me do it. And the serpent turned, there was nobody there. So the thing is, she's blaming him now. But then look at the last part of verse 5. She then says what? The very last part of verse 5. May what? May the what?
The Lord come between me and you.
Okay. The New Revised says, may the Lord judge between you and me, or come between you and me. So what is Sarah doing here at this point?
Mine says the Lord will show who's wrong.
All right, well, that's a good way. She's seeking to do what? To justify her actions. By pointing out that what she's done has actually been okay with God. God didn't stop me. God didn't say I shouldn't do this. So, what does your saying again?
The Lord will show you who's wrong. You or me.
You or me. So the thing is, she's justifying herself. And by the way, real quick, do any of you in your versions, there in that last part of verse 5, which says, uses the name Lord in the last part of verse 5, is your Lord printed in all capital letters? Yours is? What versions do y'all have? New Living, okay. But yeah, it depends. I'll be honest with you. I've looked at several different versions. It depends upon the editor as to whether you have it all capital letters or not. It just depends upon what editor, who printed your Bible on this. But when it is used with all capital letters, it's more about an emphasis, okay? Placing an emphasis upon the Lord that's going to justify what all she has done. And let's finish this up now real quickly. Look at verse 6. So for the first time, Abram now speaks and tells Sarai that Hagar belongs to you. Do what you want to with her. And as a result, Sarai treats Hagar in such a terrible way that Hagar decides that the best thing now for her and her baby to do is what? Leave. Run away. She's getting out of Dodge, okay? But what's the real result of what happens within all this? Well, first off, we see what happens when we humans seek to do God's will on our terms. First off, we see a false pride coming out of Hagar. Second, Sarai falsely puts the blame on someone else. And then third, Abram shows both impartiality and detachment when he should have been taking a stand for doing what God wanted him to do. But the end result of it all is this, that first off, Hagar in the end fails to show proper respect to Sarah. Abram lets down the family by not keeping the peace, and Sarah fails to treat Hagar graciously, which is something that Sarah should have done because of what reason? She started it. It was her idea, and she should have still been gracious with it. And so let's stop here. We'll pick up then looking at what happens with Hagar in the last part of chapter 16 here. But once again, God has revealed who He is in chapter 15. Now in chapter 16, once again, we're reminded of who we are as humans. But most importantly, what will happen to us when we start trying to do things our way, on our time, following our own plan, okay? So I want to thank you at home for being with us tonight. You blessed us by taking part in this. And until we're together next week, take care and God bless, and goodbye.